Hello, everyone. Welcome to Radical Civility. My name is Benjamin Piccini, and we are now at commandment number 2. I can't call them commandments. I can't take myself seriously. I am not on Sinai, and I am not Moses. So I'm going to call them highly encouraged iterative suggestions, because that just rolls right off the tongue, right? I say iterative, though, for a reason. I reserve the right to come back to these and change them. They're all rough drafts. I think they're good, but I don't know if they're the most important. And the whole point of having 10 is that I can't have 11 or 12 or 13. I want to see if I can pack as much into these as I can. The second encouraged suggestion is called, what I'm currently calling it is above all grace. And I think that this idea of grace is critical, and it's something that we've lost, but grace is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Grace is a very loaded term. And I'm taking full advantage of that, and I know that. So I'm using my pedantry to its full potential here. So this episode is not the full commandment. It's like one little piece of the commandment that I think is probably the most important. And I'm going to hit grace 2 or 3 different times from 2 or 3 different angles. Today, I want to start from the angle of grace as goodwill. And so with that, let's dive in. Today's episode is called Grace as Goodwill. So one of my favorite Christmas hymns when I was growing up was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I can never say his name because he's got 3 different names. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. I won't go into why. It's a very cool story, but I've always loved that hymn. And in that hymn, it references the New Testament when the angels proclaim that Jesus is being born. They say, "Peace on earth, goodwill to men." When we think of grace, we typically think of it in a religious sense. And while I'm using a religious example, I'm actually trying to define it in a non-religious way. So let me see if I can explain myself here. When I first looked up civility to try to figure out how to define it, one of the first words that came up was grace, as in social grace. And then I looked up grace and it said, well, civility. And I said, well, that's not useful at all. So I had to do some more digging and I kind of came up with my own definition. Well, I wanted to come back to this idea of grace because I think it captures something that I want to communicate. And when I looked up grace, it said goodwill. And so, when I think of goodwill, and the first words that come to me are those words from the New Testament. And I think of the Good Samaritan, and I think of seeing everyone as your neighbor, and I see peace on earth, and, beating your swords into plowshares and your spears into pruning hooks. Those are the things that come to my mind. But we're looking for something technical. We're looking for something that we can apply, mechanical almost. Like, how can I grace as a verb, right? And I think what I'm really trying to get at here is that grace means having goodwill towards others. It means that when you're in a conversation with anybody else, your goal is to do any good you can by them, to see them happier, more joyful, more at peace. Your job is to make their lives just a touch better for your having been there. So as an example, when I work with students, sometimes students are in trouble. One of the best things I think I can do for them is teach them and discipline them in a kind and firm way. I'm not saying that you just need to be nice all the time. There's a great essay that we were required to read when I was in college. It was When Nice Ain't So Nice, and it was great. It makes you think about when you're being, and it's very related to civility. Here I go on a tangent. Sometimes being nice is only nice to yourself, and you're avoiding the hard conversation that would actually be better for somebody else. But when I'm in a conversation with a student, one of the first things that I check is, am I currently thinking about what's best for the student, or am I thinking what's best for the school or for me or for somebody else? And if I can check myself and say, okay, I really am here to help this student, things tend to go pretty well. And now there's a second level to this that is perhaps even more important. I sometimes have a hard time with certain students. I think anybody who works in a school does. And one of the things that I have found that is powerful is to intentionally and sometimes even explicitly work on the assumption that the other person has goodwill towards you, even in the face of overwhelming contrary evidence. When I sit down with a student who's having a really hard time, and I assume that they really do want to be successful, they just don't know how. Not every time. There are students that are just hard for me, but I am consistently surprised how many times it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Similarly, when I'm sitting down in an evaluation conference with a teacher, and I say, that these are your scores and this is why. If I can pause for a second and say, why am I really here? I am really here for two reasons: to do as much good for this teacher as I can and to do my job and be fair. And why are they here? They are here because they want to be successful at their job. When I can frame it in my mind that way, things tend to go so much better. And so that's the first aspect of grace that I think is really worth considering. Goodwill to others and the assumption that others have goodwill towards you. We sometimes call this assuming positive intent, and I think it's a very, very powerful thing. I think that's exactly right. And once you have those two pieces of your own goodwill and the assumption of positive intent from the other, then other things start to automatically flow from those. Generosity of spirit becomes really easy. When they make a small mistake, it's easy to forgive because you want what's best for them, right? Empathy comes naturally. So if all you leave this podcast with is that grace is kind of like empathy and we should show more empathy, that to me is a win. If everyone in the country started having every political conversation with a touch more empathy, I think our conversations would change drastically. Now, I don't think that what I've talked about today is merely empathy. I think it's far bigger than that, but it is certainly a part of what we are talking about today. So this is taking that idea of civility, that idea of everybody else around you is also human, even if you don't like them, and it's amping it up a little bit. It's not just tolerate your enemy, it's love your enemy and love them as yourselves. Do good to those who use you. Do good to those who hate you. Because as it turns out, a lot of times, they really do just want what's best. I am reminded of a story. There's a story during World War I that I haven't confirmed, but I've heard that there were French and German soldiers who were in between trenches, and the fighting died down on Christmas Eve, and on Christmas Day the soldiers gathered around and were singing, and they heard each other singing in different languages, and one got up on the space between the trenches and continued singing, and then soldiers from the other side got up again, and they joined each other and sang Christmas songs together. Sometimes peace can break out just as well as war. Sometimes goodwill can happen. It's naive, and I know that, but I think we need more of it. Thanks for listening. I hope you find it helpful. Radical Civility is written, produced, and poorly edited by Benjamin Piccini. The views in Radical Civility are not necessarily the views of my employer, my religion, my family, or my